G'day there. There's lots of things that we can do to improve the landscape images that we take. But one of the most effective and personally one of my favourite things about capturing landscape images is composition. I enjoy composition because it's one of the aspects of my photography that I can continually improve on the more that I practice, and it can significantly improve my landscape photography and the images that I take. Some people struggle with composition. I know I certainly did when I started out in landscape. Some of the most frequent questions that I get asked are about composition, but I love talking about it, and I find teaching about composition in my workshops very rewarding. So in this video, we're going to explore composition and how it can improve the images that we capture. Just quickly, if you're new to my channel and you enjoy landscape photography, then check out some of my other videos after this one and consider subscribing so you don't miss out on any more videos that I upload in the future. My approach is there aren't really any rules when it comes to composition. Simply ideas, suggestions, things that you can try as you're trying to capture the best image you can. I'm going to go through some of those compositional ideas later on in the video, but I also want to discuss what composition actually does in an image. Because it was when I started to understand the role of composition in my landscape shots that I was in a far better position to decide whether a composition was working or not working in an image. You've probably heard that an image should tell a story. But what does that actually mean? And how do you do that with a landscape image? I've actually covered this in a previous video. I'll link it up here and put a link in the description below. I recommend you check it out, but here's a quick summary. A good landscape image builds a connection between the viewer and the landscape by evoking emotion. It helps the viewer see and feel what the photographer felt as they stood there in front of the scene. And the story, along with the composition, plays an important part in all of this. The story in a landscape image is the scene. It's how all of the elements in the scene interact with each other. It could be the light and how it reflects off the side of a mountain, or how the water moves over rocks. It could be how the receding tide leaves patterns in the beach sand, or how the fading light disperses through the cloud, creating that really dramatic sky. It could even be how water over hundreds of thousands of years carves a path through rock. All these elements and interactions make up the story of the landscape. And while the story is the scene, how we decide to tell that story is the composition. Our job as landscape photographers is to find the story and tell it well through the composition we use in our images. I love this analogy because while the story can stay the same, the scene, you can have two completely different photographers tell it in two different ways using different compositions, and it can have a different impact on the viewer. I prefer to call these composition ideas rather than compositional rules, because if they're taken literally, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to create a great image. In fact, it doesn't even mean that you're going to create a better one. It's not about how many rules you use or which one you use. It's more about what you're trying to achieve with your composition. Essentially, there are four main goals that I'm trying to achieve when I'm composing up a shot. The first one is find the story and help define it for the viewer. And the composition certainly helps by narrowing down what's included in the image out of that scene, so therefore what the story is going to be about. The second one is help tell the story, and the composition helps by guiding the viewer through that scene. The third one is lay out the story, because the composition essentially is the arrangement of the elements in the scene within that image. And the last one is enhance the story. Your composition can emphasize parts of the scene so that it increases the impact that it has on the viewer. So with these four goals in mind, let's have a look at some composition ideas that we can use to improve the landscape images we take. When I'm exploring a location for a shot, I'm looking around at different stories within the landscape, and there'll be different things that catch my eye, different elements and interactions within that scene. And it's not always easy to work out what will be an engaging or interesting image. And in some locations, it's difficult to work out what to include and what not to include in an image. An essential part of this process for me is to identify what the main subject is going to be. Because without the main subject, I don't know what the story is going to be about in the image, and I don't know where I want the viewer's eye to eventually land on when viewing the image. In some locations, the main subject will be pretty obvious. It'll be the waterfall, it'll be that mountain, it'll be the tree that's standing on its own. But on other occasions, it might be a little bit more subtle, like the way in which a tree in a forest stands out slightly from the others, or the way in which a wave crashes over a rock in a particular way. Or it could be the colour and texture of a leaf. Regardless, I like to work out what the main subject is up front, because a lot of the other decisions around the composition are going to be based on the main subject and its story. Along with the main subject and story of the image, there can be smaller elements, smaller stories within the scene that can be included to make a richer and more interesting image. Like of this shot at Lesmurdie Falls, where the waterfall at the back is the main subject, but I've decided to also include some of the smaller waterfalls in the lower part of the image. That helps tell the story of the water as it's making its way down through the rocks. We all want our images to be as interesting as possible. However, one trap I have fallen into in the past is trying to include everything in the shot and ending up with an image that is complex and confusing. I've often found that less is more. The less I have in an image, the more powerful the image can be. So if I do decide to include other elements in the shot, it's because by adding them or by including them, it's making the image more interesting, and it's not distracting or taking attention away from the overall story. Another composition idea to try out when you're trying to decide on what to include in an image, particularly if there is lots of unnecessary space, is to try and fill the frame with what's interesting in the scene. This also works, I've found, when there is lots of distraction as well. By filling the frame with what's interesting in the scene, it simplifies the image, removes the distraction, allowing the user to more easily focus on the main subject. In this image at Burns Beach, there's lots of rocks up and down the beach. I tried a few different compositions where I included some of the rocks in the foreground. However, what's interesting about this image is this main rock with the water flowing over the top. So I decided to just fill the frame with that part of the beach. This simplifies the composition, it removes the distracting rocks and results in a much stronger image. When you take a shot with a camera, it's taking a two-dimensional representation of a 3D scene. And obviously that can feel a little flat sometimes, but composition can help with that. By guiding the eye of the viewer around the image, you are giving it a bit more of a three-dimensional feel. Not only that, but by moving the eye to different parts of the image, you're also helping tell the story. Our eye naturally follows lines, whether they're straight or curved, and lines can be found everywhere in nature. They can be found in textures and patterns. They can also be found between two objects, like where the water is at the edge of this lake. A line can be a path between two objects like these two rocks. Lines can also be created when capturing motion in moving objects like in moving clouds or moving water. By positioning lines in your image, you're providing a structure or a pathway to guide the viewer through the image. Leading lines can be particularly effective in simple images, but are very powerful in more complex scenes where the viewer's eye needs to be helped through the image. Like in this particular example at Horseshoe Falls. There are rocks everywhere in the foreground and the midground, and it's quite easy for the eye to be lost, but I've managed to create pathways with the moving water that creates lines that lead the eye up to the main waterfalls. Equally important is recognising when lines are actually working against you, moving the viewer's eye away from the main subject or interest in the image. Here's an example of that where this jetty is curving away to the left-hand side and weakens the image because the eye gets lost to the left and doesn't move naturally up to where the horizon is or the other jetty is on the right-hand side. A strong foreground can be a very powerful element in an image. I like to think of it a bit like an introduction to the story. It's often seen or noticed first by the viewer because it seems much closer to them. It's not the main subject, but it might include other elements that are in the scene that adds to or supports the story of the main subject. Like in this particular example of Sugarloaf Rock. The rock itself is the main subject in the background, but I've positioned the camera in such a way as to pick up some of these roots in the foreground, showing some of the detail of the plants that you find in the area. Including a foreground interest in the image is a great way of showing off some of the detail in the scene because it's so close to the camera. A little tip is to use a wide angle lens because it allows you to get the camera nice and close to the foreground interest so you can capture some of that detail. Beyond having a strong foreground, including other layers in your image like interest in the midground and interest in the background can add depth and again give that three-dimensional feel to your image. Similar to leading lines, having multiple layers in your image helps guide the viewer's eye through the image. Like in this shot at the Stirling Range, where I've got multiple layers throughout the image and the eye just naturally moves from the foliage in the foreground through to the hill in the midground and then beyond through the other hills in the background. One of the tips here is that I've found that if you are going to have multiple layers in your image, you need to have some sort of separation between the layers. If the layers all merge together into one, then it's quite flat and you won't get the effect you're after. The next set of composition ideas helps in deciding how to lay out and arrange elements within the image. How you position elements within a scene can help the viewer understand and make sense of what they're seeing. You want to remove anything that feels distracting, create an image that is pleasing to the eye, and avoid awkward feeling images. Let me explain. Rule of thirds. I imagine you've heard of it. And look, if you're just starting out in landscape photography or photography in general for that matter, rule of thirds is a pretty good suggestion to try out if you're trying to work out how to get a composition to work. If you divide your image up into equal thirds, if you put an element or a subject or some sort of interest in your image on one of the thirds, then it generally is more pleasing to the eye. This can work both horizontally and vertically. Like this tree in the forest, I've placed the tree on the left-hand side, and of this shot of the seascape, I've placed the horizon on the upper third. You can also place objects where the thirds actually intersect each other as well. As I said, it's a pretty good starting point, but sometimes the rule of thirds are overused or relied on too much, and there's lots of other things to consider when trying to work out where to arrange elements in an image. When positioning elements within a composition, it's important to consider the balance of the image. If an image feels unbalanced, it can be quite distracting. This is not just about making sure that your horizon is nice and flat and even, although that is important. This is more about the overall feel of the image and where the viewer's attention is drawn to. Like in this shot of a lake in New Zealand, where all of the interest is on one side and the other side is just empty space. And the image just feels a little bit heavy on the left-hand side. Or in this shot of Canal Rocks, where the eye follows the water but ends up off the side of the image on the right. That doesn't mean that all of your elements have to be centered. In actual fact, compositions that move the eye from one side of the image to the other side of the image and back again can feel quite balanced. That's why curved lines like S-curves can work really well as leading lines. Another aspect of your photo to consider before you hit that shutter button are the borders or edges of your image. And there's two parts to this. Giving objects that are actually in your image enough room between them and the edge of the image, often referred to as room to breathe. Too close and it feels restricted, like these mountains in New Zealand. Too far away and you end up with unnecessary negative space, which can weaken an image because it's distracting and it just doesn't add anything to the story. The second part to this is to watch elements that are actually being cut off by the edge of your image. Things like these tree branches in the pine forest or a part of a rock at the beach. These elements that are cut off don't quite make sense, and so they end up being distracting in the scene. If you've got these elements in your image, you've got a couple of options. You could reposition the camera to include all of the object in the image. You could change the composition to remove the object entirely, or you could consider removing the distraction in post. The final set of composition ideas is about enhancing the story you're telling. It's about taking the message or the emotion of the image and enhancing it through the composition you create. A lot of the composition ideas that we've already covered in this video already do this, like having a strong foreground can not only draw the user into the image, but can actually help make the viewer feel as if they're actually standing in the scene. But there are a few other composition tools that you can use to increase the impact that your image can have. Negative space is an effective way of emphasizing a subject or the story around it. And I found it works well in conveying a feeling of isolation. In this shot of a solo tree on its own on a farm in the wheat belt that I actually took with an iPhone, I've broken the rule of thirds, and instead of placing the horizon on the lower third, I've placed it very close to the bottom of the image, making the tree look small in comparison to this huge sky above it. This emphasizes how remote and isolated the tree is. It's all alone. I've used another composition idea here as well, and that's symmetry. I could have placed the tree off center to the right or to the left third line, but instead I positioned the tree in the middle. I found this works well for subjects that are symmetric themselves, like this shot of Kirkafell in Iceland. The mountain slopes in a similar way on either side, so placing the mountain in the center of the image immediately gives the image balance and keeps the image simple. Another composition idea is to use framing in your image. And I found that you can use framing in at least two different ways. The first is to frame a subject with other elements in the environment, like I've done here with the Lewin Lighthouse in Augusta. By framing the lighthouse with the larger boulders, I've brought more attention to the main subject, which helps guide the viewer's eye through the image to the lighthouse. Framing can be also used around a scene, like I've done here with this waterfall hidden in amongst these twisted trees. I've used the twisted branches as a frame not only to add another element to the story, but to also give the viewer a sense that they are peering through and discovering the waterfall for themselves. Composition can be quite an abstract concept, and I want to emphasize that there's no real rules when it comes to all of this. Some people find it a bit of a challenge to understand and teach composition because it can really come down to simply how the image feels. You can also sometimes find that you're compromising between one or more composition ideas that you're trying in an image. Don't feel as if you've got to use all the compositional tips that I've shared here in the one image. However, you might find it helpful to step through each of the 4 areas where composition can help improve your image. Does the composition help define the story by what's included and what's not included? Does the composition help tell the story by guiding the viewer through the scene? Does the composition lay out the elements so it's pleasing to the eye and avoids distraction? And does the composition enhance the story so that you're capturing an image with maximum impact? To help you out with all of this, I've put together a quick guide that steps you through all the information that I've shared here, so it's easy for you to remember. So if you're interested, head over to my website and download it. The link is in the description below. I hope you found this run through of composition helpful. If you did, please give the video a like and share it with anybody who you think might find it useful. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing so you don't miss out on my next video when I upload it. But until then, thanks very much for watching.